Ever find yourself trying to untangle, a really complex situation? Sometimes the best way is just hearing directly from the people involved, their words, their actions.
Absolutely. It's about getting past the headlines, really, understanding the narratives they're actually putting out there.
Well, that's exactly what we're doing today. We're taking a deep dive into some recent statements, press conferences, mostly from the Trump administration.
Yeah, our source material is a compilation video. It's from Midas Dutch on YouTube, collects a lot of these key moments.
And the idea here is to pull out the main threads, understand the perspectives being offered without you having to sift through hours of footage.
Exactly. So if you want that quick sort of but still thorough grasp on what the administration's saying on key issues, this is for you. We'll unpack the core messages.
Highlight the arguments, maybe some recurring themes too.
And definitely flag anything that seems particularly noteworthy or, frankly, a bit surprising.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Air travel seems like a good place to start. It's been, well, messy lately.
Very messy. And Transportation Secretary Shawn Duffy held a press conference specifically on these airport and FAA problems.
So what was the main takeaway? What was he saying?
Well, the biggest theme, honestly, was blame. He was very clear that these current problems, they're the fault of the last administration.
Right, he even had that phrase, didn't he? The Biden-Buttigieg problem.
He did, and he went further, claiming that these specific issues, the radar shutdowns, planes getting too close, that stuff wasn't happening under former President Biden.
Which is quite a claim, setting up a really stark contrast there.
It is, and, it makes you think, were there similar things happening before? But what really stood out was when they asked him for a timeline for fixing things.
Oh yeah, I remember this part. He essentially said, nope, not giving a date. Why? Because he didn't want to be held accountable.
Exactly, which is quite a statement, very blunt.
It really is. What does that signal, you think?
Well, it raises questions about accountability, doesn't it? Then he sort of pivots, saying the problems are decades old.
Okay, so if they're decades old, the obvious next question is, why weren't they tackled during the first Trump term?
Precisely. And his answer for that was interesting. He said they were highlighting the cracks in the system during the first term.
Highlighting the cracks.
Yeah, and that there was a plan, apparently, for a second term to fix them. And he also claimed that money allocated by the last administration was just, quote, wasted.
So the narrative is, we saw it, we had a plan for later, but their money got wasted.
Pretty much. He used this analogy, quite vivid actually, about the previous administration hearing rattles in a car, but, just ignoring them, not fixing them.
That does paint a picture.
And then he brought up COVID, right?
Yes, he said COVID was a perfect time, his words, for the last administration to fix airport problems.
And argued they failed to do it, even though they got, what was it, $1.2 trillion for infrastructure?
That's the figure he used. So, again, pointing to a missed opportunity, mismanaged funds, according to him. And then he contrasts that with the current situation, mentioning the Biden administration's Infrastructure and Inflation Reduction Acts.
Right, but not in a good way. He points out billions going to the FAA from those acts.
And then calls Trump's own efforts scammy, fake executive orders. That's quite direct.
Very direct. And he states clearly that he and Trump want to stop those current acts. It's a very clear policy goal.
No ambiguity there.
None. And it kind of ties into his comments about government workers, too. He made some insinuations about people in Michigan.
Right, not focusing on real issues. And he criticized changing notice to airmen to notice to air mission.
Yeah, suggesting it's like bureaucratic nonsense instead of focusing on safety. Though, sometimes those name changes do reflect a shift in focus. It's hard to tell just from that.
It felt like a way to dismiss current efforts,
Yeah.
maybe. And then circling back again.
Back to the blame, yes. Describing how his administration is working hard to fix problems left to us from the Biden-Buttigieg administration, he kept using that specific phrasing.
That repetition really hammers the point home, doesn't it?
It does. And his final analogy sealed it, comparing the whole situation to buying a used car that turns out to be a lemon.
Implying all the problems were hidden under the hood by the previous owner, essentially.
Exactly. Sole responsibility lies with the seller, the previous administration.
Okay, quite a bit to unpack there on air travel. Let's shift gears. International relations, specifically Qatar. There was talk about Qatar gifting a plane, a 747.
Yes, that report surfaced. And naturally, it prompted questions about, well, influence. Is it a bribe? Does Qatar expect something?
So how did Caroline Leavitt from the administration handle those concerns?
Her main line was built on trust. She basically said, everybody knows that Trump is honest.
That's a strong assertion to start with.
It is. And she followed up by saying he'd never put himself ahead of the U.S. Then she gave some specifics on the plane itself.
Right, clarifying it was an offer to the Department of Defense.
Correct. She said the Qatari government had graciously offered to donate a plane to the Department of Defense, and the legal side was being sorted out.
And emphasized transparency and legality.
Yes, very much so. Stressed, it's always done in full compliance with the law and with utmost transparency.
Okay, but what about the quid pro quo concern? A gift that big? Surely there's an expectation.
Levi dismissed that. She said Qatar knows the president only works with the interests of the American public in mind. So again, the argument rests on his perceived integrity.
Interesting. Okay, let's move to another complex topic. South Africa, immigration, and these claims about genocide. There was discussion of a policy favoring white South African immigrants.
Yes, based on the idea that they would assimilate more easily into American society. Yeah, that was the stated rationale.
And this came up alongside an earlier executive order, right? Something about pausing refugee programs?
Exactly. That order happened on day one, pausing programs over vetting concerns. But it had exceptions.
Exceptions for national security. And this ease of assimilation point.
Those were the key ones mentioned, yes. Which then seemed to pave the way for a later order, Feb 7th, specifically about egregious conditions in South Africa.
Egregious conditions, leading to the genocide claim.
That seems to be the connection. Donald Trump himself stated, quite starkly, that there is genocide happening against white people in South Africa.
Citing land confiscation, killings of white farmers.
Yes. And he also added that the media, in his view, isn't reporting on it. It's a very, very serious charge.
Extremely serious, especially using a word like genocide.
Yeah.
Okay, let's turn closer to home. Canada. There were tensions. How was that framed?
Kevin Hassett, Trump's national economic advisor at the time, suggested Canada was actually responsible for the tension.
How so?
He put it down to a breakdown in sentiment, mentioned difficult times, and specifically a lack of rapport between Prime Minister Trudeau and the former president.
So blame shifted north of the border there.
It seems so. But Hassett also sounded an optimistic note, looking towards a new, closer relationship after a meeting happened, so maybe indicating a shift.
Right. From discord towards potential cooperation. Now let's go back to the Middle East. Saudi Arabia. Laura Trump spoke about this.
She did. She talked about Trump's trips there, especially Saudi Arabia, framing it as part of building a big, beautiful friendship.
A friendship that benefits Americans. How?
Her argument was that this strong relationship serves U.S. interests, specifically having allies in the region, sharing views on things like the Israel-Hamas situation, concerns about Iran, that sort of thing.
So the emphasis was on shared strategic interests and maintaining friendly ties.
Very much. Keeping those channels open and aligned.
Okay, so we've covered quite a few specific areas. How did the source we're drawing from, the Midas Dutch compilation, sort of wrap this all up? What was their overall critique?
Well, their concluding take was pretty critical. They pointed to what they see as a pattern from the administration, a tendency to, quote, lie and consistently blame others.
Okay, so accusing them of dishonesty and deflection.
Yes. And they also highlighted a perceived disconnect. They argued that the administration's claims about, say, economic success didn't match up with the reality for many Americans: pensions, 401ks, rising prices.
So the source is suggesting these press conferences, when you look at them closely, actually reveal, maybe not the intended message, but something about what's really taking place.
That seems to be their argument, that these briefings, despite the messaging, offer a glimpse behind the curtain, potentially showing a gap between rhetoric and reality. It pushes you, the listener, to be critical.
Right. To weigh the statements against other information.
Definitely. Encourages you not to just take things at face value.
So, just to recap then, we've done this deep dive, looked at excerpts covering air travel, Qatar, South Africa, Canada, Saudi Arabia, quite a range.
And you've heard directly from administration figures, their explanations, their justifications, where they point the finger.
It is interesting, isn't it, how certain themes keep popping up? The blaming of the last administration, the focus on personal character, framing international relations through personal ties.
Definitely recurring motifs. And as you think about all this, what questions does it raise for you? About responsibility, maybe. Where does the buck stop when you're talking about problems that might span decades?
Yeah, and how do you, as someone trying to understand it all, balance these official statements against, well, everything else you might hear or experience? Maybe the most telling part isn't just what's said, but sometimes what isn't.